To another edition of Real Talk, Straight Talk. My name is Colin Caleb. As usual, we have our panel beside me. I'd like to introduce, first of all, Mr. Carl Cardigan. In a few minutes, he'll tell you what he does, his importance, especially in Black History Month. Of course, to my right, I have the esteemed professor. You know, I like to call him the professor. He goes by the name of Mr. Omar Smith. And of course, the owner of the Fix Hair Salon, Angel. Everybody, welcome to Real Talk, Straight Talk. Before we go any further, I'd like to send a very special shout out and thanks to all our sponsors. First with the Wien Community Center, Paranite Bar and Grill. I'd like to send also a shout out to the Congress of Black Women. They've been a sponsor of ours from the very start. Up Like 7 Barbershop, of course, Angel here at the Fix Hair Salon, Ollie Interior Hair Design, are two out of London sponsors. The very first sponsor I think we ever had was Rhythm Movements Community Association. They're based in Ottawa. And of course, last but not least, Soul Kitchen Radio in Hamilton. Once again, welcome to another edition of Real Talk, Straight Talk. I'm going to turn it over now and let Carl Cardigan introduce himself and talk about the things he's been doing for at least 15 years. Is it 15 or closer to 20 years?
This is our 20th anniversary.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Once again, welcome to Real Talk, Straight Talk, Carl. It's a pleasure to have you.
Okay. Well, I am the chair of the London Black History Coordinating Committee. And 2022 is our 20th year. And we are a small volunteer-led and volunteer-driven organization. And what we do is a couple of things. We coordinate events. We promote other organizations' events. And our goal is really to educate the community, the broader community, not just the Black community, the broader community, about the importance of Black history in London. And also the contributions of the Black community in this city. It's, if you don't know the history of London, London was one of those stops on the Underground Railroad. And so there have been Black folks here for, almost 300 years. So what we do is just a little bit of work to help enhance and promote that kind of activity.
Thank you. It was so important to start Black History Month with your committee. Like you said, your committee is here to let everyone know, and not just Black people, but everybody know the importance of our contributions. One of the major aspects of Real Talk, Straight Talk is that we have dialogue about what's going on in the community, but it's not just for our community. We are inclusive, of course, that we do have members of Pride that are with us. We do invite other organizations. We've had the London Middlesex Health Unit on the podcast. We've also had the police services. And now, once again, like I said, Black History Month is on us, and so it was only fitting to start with Carl. We are having a little bit of difficulties, and we call it Real Talk, Straight Talk because we say exactly what it is. I do have to pass my mic over, so I'm going to pass it over to Angel. And I know Angel and the professor, like I said, to my right is Professor Omar. Actually, I'm going to start with Omar because he's directly to my right.
Hi, I'm Omar. Pleased to be here with you during this year's monthly special of Black History. So I'm here to learn, and I'm here to offer some opinions and perspective. Sister Angel.
Thank you so much, and welcome to Real Talk, Straight Talk. This is an exciting month for all of us, especially Black oriented. We appreciate it because we learn more about our history as well as grow from the beautiful things that we're going to learn today. And so we're looking forward to that, and we're hoping that you can call in and chime in with your opinions about the Black History Month. Thank you, Colin.
People, you do have to bear with us. Like I said, we are having a little bit of a technical difficulties. one of the first things that, actually, I'm going to go run through some of the other topics that we're going to discuss this month because they're all relevant, they're all history related. Our second topic next week will be on Marcus Garvey, Martin Luther King, of course, Bob Marley, and who am I missing?
Malcolm X.
Malcolm X. We're going to take specific quotes from each and talk about whose words are more relevant in 2022. Our third set of topics is going to be why it's important for Black history to be taught in schools. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And what should be taught? Our final topic of the month will address the church's role in Black history. And for the following 3 weeks, we will have special guests as well. Now, Carl, I'd like for you to actually start this off by giving us some information, some detailed information on historical events, historical undertakings from within London and the surrounding areas.
Well, I'm not a historian. I am just someone who's always been interested in learning about Black history. When I was in school, I grew up in Ottawa, and I remember I took, in grade 13, I took Canadian history, and I also took American history. So there are 2 history classes in grade 13, and I remember the Canadian history class had nothing at all about Black folks. And so I did an essay on Blacks in Canada. I remember going to Toronto from Ottawa, and going to Third World Books, which was kind of an establishment in Toronto that was really well known, and speaking with the owner, Lenny, and Gwen, his wife, about what I was doing, and just spending the weekend there reading, buying a few books, but also reading a lot, having discussions about Black history, and talking about why it's not taught in schools. And when I handed in the paper, the teacher, and this was the last year of high school, the teacher said to me that although I cited where I got my information, he didn't believe it was Canadian history. So I got a C on that paper because he didn't believe what I had written was Canadian history. And that stayed with me for a long time. And the library in that school had not one book that spoke about Black history. And so I think from that point on, and the American history class, which was really the next class right after the Canadian history class, the teacher was different. And I got interested in American history, but it wasn't Canadian history. It was what happened in the US. But it really, there was connection in terms of the Underground Railroad and Africans leaving the US and heading north to Canada to be free, but really there wasn't a lot that was common except the struggle. So, so Black history is important to me to try to learn a little bit about it every year. And that's what I do. And what our committee does is we try to do that as well. And London was a stop. And I had a discussion and interview today because we are part of a group that's trying to preserve what used to be called the Fugitive Slave Chapel. It was a church chapel that was built in about 1843 in London. And it was about to be torn down in about 2013, and the community rallied around to save it, and we moved it to a site, and we're looking to move it again. But in discussing that chapel and work to preserve an important part of London's history, it was really evident to me that not only was this a stop along the Underground Railroad, but it was an important stop.
Yes.
And the chapel, as an example, was a place that, it wasn't just a place where people went to worship, it was a place where people congregated. It was like a community center. It was a meeting place. There are stories, and I don't know if they're true or not, that John Brown actually spoke in that chapel. Okay. And he was, he was that man that led slaves in revolt against slavery. So London plays an important part in the Underground Railroad. The other parts of Western Ontario, people know more. Buxton and other places, and Chatham, but London also was important. And there are still families in London that were part of that movement. Okay. So London has families that are still here, that have been here for generations and generations. And there are also families that are new to London. And what we try to do in our committee is to sort of broaden each other's perspective. And it's not just for the Black community, but it's also for other communities in London to understand the importance and the contributions that have been made by folks that look like us.
And I'm going to touch back to when you said that the teacher gave you a C because they didn't. And the reason I'm going to...
Can I tell you, that paper, I submitted that paper in university.
Yes.
For another history class, second year, okay, at Carleton. I got an A+. Yes.
Wow.
But I'm going to...
So I still have that paper. I still have it.
Yeah.
It's in my desk underneath some other stuff that I hold on to. I still have it.
Do you call that a motivational paper?
I haven't looked at it for about 10 years, but every time I look at it, I get upset. So I don't look at it anymore.
Yeah, and I understand why. And that's part of why I said how relevant is our history. Imagine that Carl did a paper, the teacher didn't know enough, and I think that speaks to what on a general level is not known about Black history. Black history in Canada is not taught the same way as American history is taught in America. They make such a big deal of telling you the facts on what has happened, right? They also have people that they look up to more in the sense of, like you said, you mentioned the name John Brown. Of course, if you come forward, you have Martin Luther, you have Miss Rosa Parks for the bus. And the average Canadian can tell you more about Black American history than they can tell you about Black Canadian history. When I talk about the relevance, why is it relevant? I think of things as my kids growing up. What do they know? What do they have to be proud of? Where do they stand? It identifies us as a people, which is one of the things that your committee is trying to do. Now, is that the fault of us as a people, or is that the fault of the government in a sense? And you being a professor, where do you stand in what's relevant and what we should know, what we shouldn't know?
Okay, I think my brother Carl here raised an interesting point about writing his paper and pretty much got his paper rejected. There's still a lot of people within the system, and I'm presuming Carl went to school a couple of decades ago. There's still people in the system that when they're teaching the teachers, these things are not taught as a part of their pedagogy. When I studied in the US, I did American history, but there's also a class called African American history. And I still remember that class primarily because the teacher who taught me was from the Army, and his father or grandfather fought in the Second World War. So he was telling us that, because there was quite a bit of African and Caribbean students in the class, that when they went to the war, it was the Black people from the Caribbean, especially the Jamaicans, that were actually talking to them to say, why are you here fighting and you can't go in the bar and have a drink? Why are you here fighting and you can't, travel on the bus? And it was that impetus that they took back and really wrapped up the civil rights movement that ultimately led to their freedom. So I really value that a lot. Now, in terms of my own perspective, as somebody being a part of the education system, there's still not a lot of emphasis being placed on this aspect of Canadian history. Why, I really don't know, but I think what better time now than having a discussion, considering the time we're in, to actually make an effort to make sure these things are taught. I can tell you that there are improvements, because I know of people now who are training in the higher education system, and a big component of how to go in a classroom and teach is now focusing on diversity, is now focusing on anti-racism, is now focusing on a lot of stuff, poverty and all that type of stuff, and stuff like that gives me hope.
Mm-hmm. And just to add on to that, I mean, I really enjoyed Carl's story about his essay that he wrote, because I was just reading, like before the show, I had to catch up on my Canadian history part of it, of how we became to celebrate Black History Month. And it dawned to me that this was only passed in 1995. And yet in the US, if you look at it, this was something that was created by Carter G. Woodson in 1926. And it started off as the Negro History Week, and then went along to be a month-long thing in 1976. So if you look at that, they've had time to celebrate in the US, and that's all we've had to go by as Canadians now. We've had to go by the history of how Black history became celebrated by understanding what Rosa Parks did, what Martin Luther did for us, what Malcolm X did, but we didn't have the part of history that we would have wanted to know about Canada. So I was reading, and I was also like excited because I'm African. I actually studied history for my A-levels, and we did world history as well as African history. So when we did the world history, it was interesting because that's when we studied the Atlantic slave trade and all that stuff, and how things became to be that our people ended up in America, some ended up in Canada, some ended up on different islands. So it's interesting that you say that your paper was deemed a C because they didn't have that knowledge, and because of the knowledge that they had, they probably placed it to the US and said, you're bringing US stuff to Canadian history. This is not Canada. So it's very, very exciting. It's nice to hear about this, and I love that you ended up getting an A. I'd love to read that paper one day.
What I found interesting about what Mr. Kyle said was that when he went to university, his paper was more welcome. And that goes to the point that I'm saying, that I know in the higher education system, and when I say that I mean that people are going to colleges and universities to learn how to teach. That element is being taught. Now, in the lower level, in the elementary level, that really impacts our kids, I can't speak too much about that component.
And then, I'm glad that you said that, because to me, if you don't start them at a younger age, right, to understand who they are as people, it also helps in their development. It also helps in their choosing to go further. For instance, I always tell the story of my daughter when she was doing university. She said to me that in London, Ontario, there's a higher percentage of Black males will go on to post-secondary education in Toronto than in London. Part of that is in London, when you look around, you don't see enough people like you, right? Especially on the professional level. Part of that is not knowing, knowing the history, because they say to be able to go forward, you also have to know your past, right? So if you know your history, especially the moments, and especially the moments that are I don't know if you call them groundbreaking in the sense of moving the struggle beyond. And maybe part of that is because Canada did not have the same kind of struggle that the U.S. did. And I always say because of that, it kind of put us behind a little bit. It didn't give us it didn't give us that one central issue to rally around. And so it's sort of like you look at people and they kind of have the thought that, yeah, history is important to us, but it's not. Because even in Canada, there's some people that'll say that, you know what, slavery wasn't in Canada. And I always say you can't abolish something that never was, right? Regardless, it might not have been to the extent of it of being in the States, but it was still here, right? And Carl, I'm going to ask you to address the fact, like I said, we didn't have that one central issue to really rally around. Do you think that's been a hindrance for us, or?
Well, yeah, I would say that, like, I read a lot.
Yes.
And I was interested in reading.
Yes.
I was interested in knowing about history. You can't do a lot about what has passed, but you certainly can try to sort of correct the present and hopefully change the future.
Yes.
And so for me, I used to read a lot, and most of the books I read were by U.S. writers, or Caribbean writers. Yeah. So I have a sense of how people in the Caribbean and U.S., how I have a sense of the history. In Canada, I had to dig deep to find out stuff. I had to find out. But in the U.S., it's right there. In the Caribbean, you can read whoever you want to read. You could, you can learn. I remember, and on the 12th, we are having two things are happening on the 12th as part of Black History Month. We have a film, 100 Years of Faith. It's a film about the oldest black church in Quebec. And it's a film that was made by Anthony Sherwood about 10 years ago or so. He also did a film about black soldiers in World War I. I knew a little bit about it, but his film is really interesting because black soldiers signed up to fight in World War I, and they were turned down.
Yes.
They were turned away. They ended up going, but they dug ditches and graves. That's what they did. They had no guns, they couldn't fight, but they had uniforms, and they were part of the Canadian or British, whatever, armed forces, but they weren't allowed to fight. Mm-hmm. And that's a fact, or history. But you have to dig deep to find that out.
And that therein is one of the things that I'm alluding to, is that it's not put out there on the same level that America puts out their history. You like to read. Omar likes to read. I can say that I like to read to a certain level. But for those that, not everybody reads like we will read. Not everybody will search information like we will search. In the U.S., they make an effort to put it out there so that it's relevant. They make it relevant. So it's not, I have to search for it, I have to look for it, I have to dig for it. For instance, one of the first things that happened when I came to Canada, I used to watch cartoons in the morning. On Saturday mornings, they used to have a lot of cartoons. In between the cartoons, they used to put up historical facts. It might have been white historical facts at the time, but they put up these historical facts, and they had it in forms of cartoons. I remember reading about Betty Ross or Betsy Ross knitting the flag, and it was on a cartoon. So they addressed what they needed to, and that goes with them selling Americanism, and this is how they sold it. They sold it in all aspects, right? Canada, on the other hand, and they force us to dig for it. It's not put out there. Part of the reason I think it's not put out there is because Canada never really said that we had slaves. You never hear that being addressed in Canada. Like I said, the average, if you go up to the average person and said, you know what, there were slaves in Canada, they will look at you.
But then you also have to look at it in the sense that Canada was considered as an escape for slaves. They came to Canada.
But they had slavery to a point. And because of that, I think Canada on a whole is hid behind that because they're saying, yes, we provided this safe space. So we don't have to talk about what we did before the safe space.
I am not sure I would necessarily agree with that. I think if you juxtapose between the U.S. and Canada, it's two different countries. One is a little bit more rowdy, one is a little bit more assertive, and one is a little bit more in your face. And that's just the DNA of how the country is. They're proud people and they demonstrate their patriotism in very flamboyant ways. Canada, on the other hand, is a little bit more reserved, a little bit more passive. So a lot of things, as you mentioned, is not necessarily out there. But I could also say the experiences of black people have motivated them to write books, have motivated them to do films, and have motivated them to do plays as a way of keeping certain components of the history alive. Now, the two most historical figures in Canada that I know about is Viola Desmond and Angelique, the lady from Montreal. But a lot of people don't know about Angelique.
Yeah.
You know, the lady that came here as a slave. She was accused of burning down some building in Montreal, and they tortured her and burned her at the stake. You see what I'm saying? So while Canada is definitely not as rich and powerful as America, there are a lot of black people here with loud voices. There are a lot of black people here with resources, and the onus is on the creative industries and the people in academic and the historians like Mr. Carl to get these stories told out there in books, in films, in documentaries, so we can actually watch that. And by doing that in the various mediums, now I know you say, a lot of people don't like to read. I believe everybody likes to read, but they find the information that they want.
Yeah.
They're not going to go and read this stuff because they consider it boring, and they're not interested. But for someone as boring as me, yeah, I find that exciting.
Yeah.
So I go and I read. Last Black History Month, I watched my kids are learning about Black history in school, and I bought the movie of Malcolm X. We sat and we watched the movie, and I explained to them he had certain views about certain people, how he got enlightened, and now he had a total different outlook, but he never had an opportunity to make the change he wanted because his life was cut short. Yes. Just recently, there was a documentary on Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. A lot of people don't know that they were very good friends. But because of the fallout within the Nation of Islam, Muhammad Ali took the side of Elijah Muhammad and actually shunned him. There were two of them met in Africa, and he was calling out Muhammad, Muhammad, and he walked past him.